How often do you think about what clothes you wear to work or school? On the surface, this seems like a mundane thing, but many people devote a lot of mental space to this. Many people also have to spend no trivial amount of money on the clothes they wear and how they present themselves in educational and professional settings. Perhaps most importantly, people of different social identities have to think very differently about these things. Gender identity and sexuality are major sources of difference and inequality in how people have to think about the ways that they clothe their bodies in day-to-day life. One of the things I study is professional socialization, or the ways people learn to become members of a profession. This issue about gender emerged as a major finding in my first book entitled Lesson Plans: The Institutional Demands of Becoming a Teacher. I spent over a year studying the experiences of a group of college students who were teacher candidates in their last year of training to become school teachers. They included elementary and secondary teachers and teachers preparing to teach different subject matters, math, language arts, and social studies for the most part. I conducted what we call an ethnography of teacher education. Ethnography is a type of qualitative research and data collection in which the researcher does field work in particular settings to observe how people interact in everyday routines. We also often interview the people in our studies and collect all kinds of documentation that they use in daily routines. The goal is to get really familiar with a group of people, what they do, what they care about, and what kind of challenges they face. I wanted to study how people become teachers. One of the unique strengths of ethnography as a research methodology is that the analytic process is inductive. You collect data, analyze it for patterns, and let the data tell you what the empirical story is. Taking this approach can lead you in directions you don't anticipate. In fact, it should. When I started this study, I was primarily interested in how teachers cope with the many challenges that their work poses to them. In particular, I was curious about how accountability policies, curriculum standards, and student discipline policies affected their work and how they responded to them. And certainly, those issues were key parts of the analysis and the findings of the book. What I didn't expect when I started collecting data was how frequently the issue of what they could and couldn't wear kept coming up over and over again. But it did, over and over again. But it came up in very particular and gendered ways. It was women who received the majority of the messages about clothes, and these messages were routinely delivered as warnings about what women could not wear as much as what they could. Now, some background to set the stage for these findings. It's well known that the profession of teaching is dominated in numbers by women, has been for a long time. More than 70% of all teachers identify as women. More than 90% of elementary teachers identify as women. I collected my data at a large university in the Midwest with a well-known school of education, and the demographics reflected the profession overall, predominantly women and predominantly white. I included 49 aspiring teachers in my study and observed them take their classes, interviewed them, their instructors and supervisors, and then observed them in their student teaching component of their training, where they teach regular classes in local schools. Very early in my fieldwork, the issue of what people could wear came up, and it was directed primarily at the women. Just a few weeks into my fieldwork, one faculty member at the School of Education made an announcement to his class of prospective math teachers, quote, "especially for the ladies, a warning about dress codes in schools. Apparently, 10 principals have complained about what some people are wearing out into the schools for field experiences. They are threatening to kick people out of their school," end quote. In another instance, a male administrator talked in vivid detail about what kinds of underwear women shouldn't wear, or at least let people see when they're working in schools. The potential consequences for them were serious. Dismissal from the program. So I asked teacher candidates in interviews how they interpreted what warnings like this mean. One woman explained, quote, "Guys can have a pair of khakis and a button-up shirt, but for girls, it might matter how those pants fit or what style they are or how low cut your shirt is," end quote. I also asked why they think women receive these warnings. One teacher candidate replied, quote, "Girls have to be smart about what they wear. High school boys are high school boys. You can't ignore that. If you don't have any common sense, you probably shouldn't be a teacher. You should realize you can't wear a miniskirt to teach," end quote. This perspective among future teachers came up a lot. Quote unquote, "Boys will be boys." There was a taken for granted element to it, as assumptions about gender tend to operate in social life, and this was largely shared among teacher candidates, their faculty, and school personnel alike. The gendered assumption that boys will be boys in this context means that we often presume that boys and men are, number one, heterosexual, number two, compulsively attracted to women, and number three, unable to control their sexual impulses themselves, none of which are necessarily true. What does this mean for women? They are often taught and trained that it's their professional responsibility to cover their bodies so as not to arouse the inevitable sexual urges of men, teenagers, and even boys who are children. Many prospective teachers are trained that it is their job to manage what is assumed to be the natural behavior of boys and men. This is an element added to their work, that their bodies are a potential problem that they must manage, and it's a source of inequality between women and men who work in the exact same profession because men do not have to monitor their bodies in the same way. But that doesn't mean that cisgender men are not also affected by these very traditional assumptions about gender in their professional socialization. The same cultural assumption about gender captured by the phrase, quote unquote, "boys will be boys," affects the work experience of men who enter teaching as well. In my own study and in the research of other scholars, men who enter the professions that put them in frequent contact with children are very often subjected to suspicion about their motives for doing that work. Again, the assumption is that men are hostages to their heteronormative sexual impulses, and men who seek work with children, it's the same assumptions about gender and sexuality. They just affect men differently than they affect women in the context of their professional socialization and day-to-day work. In my study, one young man training to become a high school language arts teacher shared an experience in one of his instructional methods courses with other teacher candidates. He told them that he was working in a local school, logging his required hours, observing a classroom, and a high school girl asked him out. His classmates teased him, but he responded with, quote, "To hell with you guys, I was scared," end quote. And he was scared because he was worried that other adults in the building would assume he was seeking to date teenagers in the school. Other scholars have found similar patterns in the experience of men who work with kids. Sociologist John Pruitt, for example, finds that men who enter preschool teaching feel they are under constant suspicion about their motives. Very traditional assumptions about gender and sexuality become interwoven into the professional training and work experiences for people in ways that are difficult for them to deal with. Many women are forced to think about their bodies as a problem they must manage and cover. Some people have breasts. They can't leave them at home when they go to work, and general standards of appropriate business casual attire should be sufficient in any context without shaming women for their bodies. In addition, there are men who have a genuine and non-threatening interest in working with children, and children benefit when men are involved in their lives. No one wants to get up and go to work in an environment where people wonder if you're a pedophile for no other reason than your gender identity. These professional socialization processes likely contribute to the perpetuation of these common and often misleading assumptions about gender and sexuality in ways that aren't real good for kids. There have been ongoing debates in recent years about school dress codes and policies, and the very same assumptions about gender and sexuality motivate many of the discussions. Girls are targeted by many dress codes, disciplining the kinds of pants, skirts, and tops they can and cannot wear. The justifications are often statements like, quote, "It's distracting," end quote, especially for boys. Because, according to common gendered assumptions, boys will be boys. This is both a form of body shaming for girls and an excuse for not teaching boys appropriate ways to interact with people. It's no surprise that many professional educators advocate for such dress code policies because they were subjected to the very same gender norms as part of their training for the job.